This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Coming to you from places unknown in the summer of 2019. Let me give you a little best of today. First, I want to talk a little Moneyball, a little baseball, a little attitude, a little bit about numbers. Because, man, it's always a great reminder. Right from there, Robin Hanson, an economist at my alma mater, George Mason University, getting into the notion of AI and what it will look like when it arrives for the first time. And bringing up the rear on this nice little summer special, one Charles Faulkner, dipping into a decades ago presentation. I love the way Charles thinks, and he's coming on the show again soon with fresh new insights. Let's jump right into a little Earl Weaver and baseball. In numbers, thinking in terms of numbers, counting, is not something as a population, as a whole population, that we like to do. Emotions rule. Gut feels rule. I mean, having a philosophical bent, a philosophical direction for one's life with a certain formula that you follow, and that formula will crank out wins and perhaps some major home runs, some major victories over the course of a lifetime. Maybe it won't be consistent, but it will get the big home runs. Consistency is the illusion. I'm not sure exactly how consistency, in whatever discipline one wants to talk about, I'm not sure how consistency became the norm, the accepted way that so many people think life unfolds. Today, another great anti-consistency story. In the late 1970s, the early 1980s, I lived very close to Baltimore, Maryland. As a kid who was playing baseball, and there was no Washington Nationals team at the time, the Baltimore Orioles were it. I knew all of their players. I knew all of the players at all of the starting positions. I probably knew every player for years, probably half a decade. I followed that team so closely. But I did not know their secret at the time. I knew they were good. I knew they had many all-stars, from Eddie Murray to Cal Ripken. I mean, they were a badass team. They were successful. And they had a fiery manager, a short guy named Earl Weaver. I did not know at the time, because I was a young guy, I did not know exactly why they were so successful. But Earl Weaver had a strategy that really became, later on in the decades, the foundation for Moneyball. Earl Weaver was the Moneyball thinker before Billy Beane made it famous, before Michael Lewis wrote the book, before John Henry won the World Series with the Red Sox. Before I jump into some of that Earl Weaver technique, which I think applies to other disciplines in life, the main reason I'm going to talk about Earl Weaver baseball strategy today is because it applies outward, specifically to investing. But first, let me introduce Earl Weaver.
Piling dirt on home plate, walking off the field with a base, and verbally assaulting umpires was all part of the act. Kicking and screaming, Earl Weaver quickly became public enemy number one amongst Major League umpires. But Weaver wasn't just one of the most entertaining skippers of his era. He was, without question, one of the most successful. Weaver's managerial style and thus his team's identity was often best phrased as pitching fundamentals and three-run home runs. Involved in every meticulous detail about the Orioles organization, Weaver sculpted his teams on defensive fundamentals and preached patience at the plate.
Weaver believed that fundamentals were the most important advantage they could have. And so while other teams were taking batting practice by the hour after hour after hour, the Orioles had everybody over there with Weaver screaming at them about which base to cover every bunt play, every pickoff play, every cutoff play, every signal you could relay.
I don't think there was a greater student of the game. His ability to pick 25 guys when he left spring training was probably the best thing that Earl ever did as a manager.
Earl got the most out of his players, and what he would do, he would recognize what your skills and abilities was, what you're capable of doing, and he would put you in a position to be successful.
Earl was a chemist, mixing and matching his superstar and bench players to produce the perfect product on the field. A managerial pioneer, Weaver perfected the use of advanced scouting, using statistics to create favorable matchups for both his batters and his pitchers.
He knew if you had good statistics against a certain pitch, you were going to play that night. If you didn't, it didn't matter what you were doing, you weren't going to be in that lineup.
Winning to Weaver wasn't out-managing the competition, rather adjusting to the ebb and flow of the entire major league schedule, managing to his strengths. Getting the most out of all 25 spots on the roster became known as the Weaver Way, and it worked.
To know who's in the Hall of Fame.
Oh, you're going to be in the Hall of Fame?
Know it.
Why?
You know
World Series?
You know it.
You're going to be in the Hall of Fame?
You know it. I've won more than I've lost, kid.
I know you haven't.
Games, count games, stupid.
Weaver's contempt for the umpires was generally mutual, but over 17 seasons of managing, Weaver's Orioles won 1,480 games. And in 1996, 10 years after Weaver walked away from the game for a second time, he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And in classic Earl Weaver fashion, he had a message for the umpires.
Now, counting balls and strikes and close plays on the bases, they must have made over 1 million calls while I was managing. And except for those 92 times I disagreed, they got the other ones right.
Beyond the thousands of wins, ruckus ejections, and battles with his players, Earl Weaver was a teacher. It is he that's credited with moving Cal Ripken Jr. from third base to shortstop. He was a pioneer in a game that's now largely driven by statistics. 6 Oriole legends are enshrined in Cooperstown, and it's no mistake that Earl Weaver had his stamp on all of them. Later in life, Weaver joined the broadcasting ranks and retired to Florida, where days at the beach were a stark contrast from his fierce arguments on the field.
You can quickly see, even if you know nothing about baseball, the Baltimore Orioles, or Hall of Fame manager Earl Weaver, you can quickly see the phrase statistics thrown out. Now, that was not normal in the 70s and 80s inside baseball. No way, no how. This guy saw something early on, and that was how he structured his team. Let me read an excerpt from the Society for American Baseball Research, an excerpt from Brian DeFate. All managers think about strategy, but one can argue that no manager this side of John McGraw changed our prevailing understanding of baseball strategy as much as Earl Weaver. In his seminal work, Weaver on Strategy, and in various quotations uttered while holding court, Weaver presented insights that may have long been implicitly understood by the best thinkers on the game, whether managers, players, or sports writers, but which did not articulate basic principles as universal truths the way he did. Most notably, Weaver stressed, your most precious possessions on offense are your 27 outs. Until Weaver called attention to it, the concept of only 27 outs was, and perhaps still too often is, lost in the actual playing of the games. Managers may resort to various stratagems to try to seize an advantage, particularly in the early and middle innings, at the expense of thinking about the long arc of the game. Weaver's constant awareness of the potential importance of each out was at the very core of the offensive strategies that characterize his legacy. Today, Earl Weaver, as a grand strategist, is remembered for his philosophy on the merits of the 3-run home run, disdain for run creation strategies, and deliberately building his bench with pinch hitting and substitution options for position players in anticipation of batter-pitcher matchups. This also allowed him to platoon in his daily starting lineup with nearly wild abandon. Quote, "You need someone for each job that needs to be done when the time arises," end quote. Weaver was a manager with a plan for every individual player on his team. The Earl of Baltimore did not want mere emergency backup players on the bench who rarely played but were there when needed. He didn't just want utility players who could play a variety of positions or a power bat from each side of the plate. He had in mind a specific set of roles, that's plural, for each player sitting on the Baltimore Orioles bench. He knew what each could do in particular situations against particular pitchers and used them often and accordingly. Everybody played, and he expected them to all contribute. You can see with this thinking at a ground level, he's thinking of the totality of all aspects of the game. Now, if you are going to approach investing or trading and you're not looking at all aspects of the game and it's just another game, how can you pretend that you will be successful? Earl Weaver, to me, is as much of an influence on my mindset of good trend following trading as the good trend following traders. Because that mindset of wanting to hit a 3-run home run to get the big gainer is the same thinking. Continuing with this excerpt, the fundamental premise of Weaver's offensive strategy was, quote, "In my mind, the home run is paramount because it means instant runs," end quote. Since the end of the dead ball era, any manager who had sluggers on his team loved the 3-run home run. Miller Huggins certainly did with Ruth and Gehrig, Joe McCarthy with Gehrig and DiMaggio, Casey Stengel with Mantle and Berra, even McGraw, who was a loudmouth evangelist for scientific small ball as the best way to score runs, surely appreciated first baseman George Kelly as one of the National League's premier home run hitters when the Giants won 4 straight pennants from 1921 to 1924, not to mention young slugger Mel Ott, who hit 42 home runs for him in 1929. Small ball has its place, but as Earl Weaver said, there is no more sure or faster way to score runs than with a home run, especially with runners on base. Look, nobody can predict a home run. Nobody can say it's going to happen next. But what Earl Weaver was doing as a manager was putting players on his team in a certain position that they could maximize the chance of a 3-run home run. He wasn't trying to bunt people on. He wasn't trying to steal inordinate amounts of bases. No, he was putting his team in a position to score bunches fast. And it was super successful. Continuing with this excerpt. Interestingly, none of Earl Weaver's teams, however, ever led the American League in homers, which of course belies his faith and commitment to the home run. In his 14 full seasons as manager, Weaver had only 2 of his players finish in the top 3 in home runs. Eddie Murray, who tied with 3 others for the league lead in the strike-disrupted 1981 season, and Reggie Jackson, who finished second in 1976, his only year in Baltimore, Yankee fans. But though the Orioles under Weaver never had more than the 3rd highest home run total in the league, when they did peak at 3rd, it coincided with their pennant-winning years of 1969, 1970, and 1979. Then again in 1976, 1978, and 1982. Weaver nonetheless usually did have a pair of dangerous power hitters who delivered in the middle of his lineup. Frank Robinson and Boog Powell when he won 3 straight pennants from 69 to 71. Lee May and Don Baylor in 1975, May and Reggie Jackson in 1976, May and Eddie Murray in 1977 and 1978, Murray, Ken Singleton, and his left field platoon of Gary Renicky and John Lowenstein from 1979 to 1982. These guys could make the 3-run home run happen with some measure of frequency. The only years Weaver's Orioles lacked consistent power were from 1972 to 1974, after Frank Robinson had been traded away and as Boog Powell got older, and before the arrivals of May, Singleton, and Murray. The bottom line, this man was showing early on in the baseball statistical mindset way of being that a home run was killer. A home run made things happen. Of course, I bring it back to trend following trading. You can't know when the next home run trend is going to happen. You have no clue. I have no clue. The best experts have no clue. I flipped on CNBC the other day. Some guy that said he was the top Asian strategist in Asia. Goldman Sachs employee. He looked like an alien, making all these predictions that he knew what was going to happen in China. Please tell me, how does some white guy from Goldman Sachs have any clue what the government of China is going to do next? He doesn't. But if you can put that type of thinking aside, this desire for consistency, because the alien analyst from Goldman Sachs is only trying to sell you on consistency. It's an illusion. It's fake. It doesn't happen. But what if you turned it on its head? What if you walked away from this podcast and said, you know what? The idea of a 3-run home run in investing sounds a lot better to me. It makes a lot more sense to me to try and find the 3-bagger, the 10-bagger, the 20-bagger. How do I put myself in a position to benefit when I don't know when the next home run is going to happen? How can I put myself in a position to try and capture the next home run? That's why I love Earl Weaver. Earl Weaver made it cool to try and hit the home run. He made it cool to try and win the big game with one swing. That does not mean, of course it does not mean, that he was reckless. He had a strategy. He had a game plan to take what was given and take advantage of it. Super critical. Investing, baseball, venture capital, financing a film. Any discipline where you are facing uncertainty, where the knowns are unknown, and you can't be so sure, put yourself in a position to maximize the upside. Now, of course, for those of you out there that don't know about baseball, what I'm about to play might go right over your head. You might not get it. You might think I'm crazy. You might think I'm crass. You might think I'm rude. I'm sure some of you will. But there's a reason that sometimes a few drops of profanity make it onto this podcast. It's because I played baseball. I can't get it out of my system. I don't want to sound rude. I don't want to sound crass. And I have to do a better job of keeping the profanity out of the podcast. I know that. So today, it's not my profanity. It's Earl Weaver's profanity that I want to add to the podcast. Because for those of you that do understand baseball or have followed baseball or knew about the Baltimore Orioles under the management of Earl Weaver, this next clip is going to make you smile. Taken from a call-in show. I don't know if this was fake, if this was real. I never heard it when I was a kid, of course. They did not play this on the air. So I'm assuming it was fake. Maybe it was recorded to be real at the time, or he was just joking around. Who cares? 30, 40 years later, it's absolutely on target fun with Earl Weaver. Because for all of that brilliant statistical analysis that man had in his mind, he's a pretty funny guy too. Enjoy.
Now, the Manager's Corner, with the thoughts and opinions of the American League's winningest manager, the Orioles' Earl Weaver. And now, to the Manager's Corner with Earl Weaver.
Bill Whitehouse, Earl, from Frederick, Maryland, wants to know why you and the Orioles don't go out and get some more team speed.
Team speed, for Christ's sake. You get fucking goddamn little fleas on the fucking bases, getting picked off, trying to steal, getting thrown out, taking runs away from you. You get them big cocksuckers that can hit the fucking ball out of the ballpark and you can't make any goddamn mistake.
Well, certainly this show is going to go down in history, Earl. Terry Elliott of Washington, D.C. wants to know why you don't use Terry Crowley as a designated hitter all the time.
Well, Terry Crowley's lucky he's in fucking baseball, for Christ's sake. He was released by the Cincinnati Reds. He was released by the fucking goddamn Atlanta Braves. We saw that Terry Crowley could sit on his fucking ass for 8 innings and enjoy watching a baseball game just like any other fan, and has the ability to get up there and break one open in the fucking ninth. So if this cocksucker would mind his own business and let me manage the fucking team, we'd be a lot better off.
Well, certainly you've made your opinions known on the fans' questions about baseball, Earl, but let's get to something else. Alice Sweet from Norfolk wants to know the best time to put in a tomato plant.
Alice Sweet ought to be worried about where the fuck her next lady's coming from, rather than where her next goddamn tomato plant's coming from. If she'd get her ass out to fucking bars at night and go hustling around the goddamn street, she might in her once in a while. I don't understand where these questions are coming from, Tom. That's about it from Manager's Corner. Go fuck yourself, and the fuck with your show coming up next on the Baltimore Oriole Baseball fucking Network.
I just love that man's attitude. I love that man's attitude. You can take all the baseball coaches today, forget it. I want Earl Weaver. Let's jump right into Robin Hansen and the Singularity. We all love the Terminator. We all talk about the red pill, the blue pill, the Matrix. My guest today is Robin Hansen, professor of economics from my alma mater, George Mason University. His new work, his new book, The Age of M as in emulation. Robin is looking ahead approximately 100 years to see where things evolve to that point of singularity, that point of artificial intelligence. What will it look like? What will the world be like? And how, if we do look ahead to that future, how can it possibly help us today in our own time? A really interesting guy, great insights, and a book that will make you think. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Robin Hansen. I hope when somebody in Hollywood starts to take these ideas and compose them into and put them on the silver screen, I hope you get paid for it. Or here's the question. Or did this kind of, I don't know if I want to call it silly, but this interesting movie with Johnny Depp. Did you see this thing, Transcendence?
I did see it.
Tell me your thought process. Is Hollywood going to rip you off, or have you been stealing a little from Hollywood?
In the world of ideas, you should be happy that people steal, quote unquote, your ideas, as long as other people can sort of find the origins. You know, the vast majority of people in the intellectual world, they put something out there and then it falls flat and nobody ever does anything with it. So I'd be happy if people picked this up and went with it. I'd be happy if people wrote stories in this. Of course, I expect that since what I've done is so unusual, it won't be that hard for me to claim credit if people do.
Exactly. That's what's fun, though, because, I mean, as a guy that's written a few books, I mean, and I'm struggling this now as I'm working on this kind of like next one, and I really want it to be something that I think what you were striving to do would probably have reached on yours, which is something where it really causes people to go, wow, damn, that's a perspective.
Yeah, so when you're like in with all the hip, cool intellectuals, you can sort of do a little variation on what they do, and you can probably expect to get credit for it if there's some credit. But when you're kind of on the outside, you have to do something really pretty different if you expect to get credit, because otherwise all the cool guys will just, if they do see what you did, they'll sort of add a little bit to it and change the names and then kind of ignore you.
I saw this TED Talk of yours. I don't know. It seems like you're becoming one of the cool guys now.
Well, not yet, but we can always hope.
Okay, let's jump right into this. This is, people love to have this conversation. It could be, around the family dinner table, bars, clubs, whatever. The quote singularity and the idea that I guess you're probably going to phrase it better than me, but the point where robots really are us. They can be just like us. I want you to lay this out and explain to the audience your thought process, the premise of your work. But for me as a novice, I kind of look at it, you're like, okay, there's a couple different ways we can get there. And you've got a way that for us novices, I would call, you're photocopying us human beings. It's something like that, but in a very in-depth way. Why don't you talk about the genesis of this work and this idea of when those robots will get to that point and the various options that we have to possibly get there? Because this is a matter of computational power, and this is a matter of time. I mean, how much time will it take to get to this point of this singularity? And I think this is where you go, are there possibly faster ways?
All right. So I didn't invent the idea that someday we may have machines as smart as people. It's a staple of futurism and thinking about the long run for a very long time. For a long time, people have outlined a number of different ways that this could happen. And in our era, one way is, of course, the way we have been doing it, slowly writing more better software. And if nothing else happens, within a few centuries, we'll have enough better software that just big piles of software could replace people. Many people hope and even expect that we'll have some grand insight into the nature of intelligence that will make this easier, and it won't just be plain old software. It'll be super duper AI software of some special sort. But that's another scenario. Eventually, we have a better idea of how to model intelligence in the brain. The third scenario that I'm focused on is the idea of porting software. So today, when you have software that runs on an old computer and you want to make it run on a new computer, you could just stare at the old software and what it does and try to write software on the new computer that acts like the old, or you could port the software. That is, you could write what's called an emulator on the new computer that makes the new one look like the old, and then you just move the software over to the new computer wholesale without understanding it. It's a black box, but you can still just run it there because you've made the new computer look like the old computer. So that the idea is to do the same thing for the human brain. The human brain runs on hardware, i.e. all these little cells that send signals around. And if we can make good enough models for how these cells work, and we can make a good enough scan of a brain to see exactly which cells are where, connected to what, and of what type, then we should be able to port the software that's in that particular human's brain, i.e. make a computer model that has all the same structure of which cells are connected to which. It's got models of each cell that shows that processes them in the same way as the original. And if our models of the cells are good enough and the scan is good enough, then the whole thing has to be good enough, i.e. it has to have the same input-output behavior. You hook it up to hands, eyes, ears, mouth. You could talk to it. It talks back. You could ask it to do something, and it might do something. Once this is cheap enough that they're cheaper than humans, everything changes.
In a nutshell, what we're really doing, we could either use you as an example or me as an example. We're taking you, Robin, and we're copying you, and we're putting you on a hard drive. And as long as you have the ability to communicate, and there's many different ways you could communicate, you are now essentially, all that gray matter inside your skull right now has been transferred, downloaded, uploaded, however one wants to call it, to this drive. And you are now, for all intents and purposes, duplicated inside the system, inside the machine, on a drive, correct?
Right. Now, this is one way to reach artificial intelligence. It's one of several ways. But there's two interesting reasons to focus on it, which is why I have focused on it. One is there's plausible reasons to think it might happen first. Our progress in the other kinds of AI has actually been pretty slow. So at past rates of progress, it'll probably take several centuries to eventually reach human-level abilities. And the trends on this kind of process seem to say that it'll happen roughly in 1 century or so. So that's a reason to think this will happen first. It's not a really strong reason because there's a lot we don't understand, but it's a reason to think about it. The other reason to think about this scenario is that it's much easier to understand. Many people have taken it as an axiom that once machine intelligence shows up, that's a strange and incomprehensible world, and they've even called it the singularity to give this idea that there's a horizon beyond which we can't see there. You just can't understand past this horizon. However, these brain emulations, since they're direct, almost exact copies of individual people, they are very human-like. They have human personalities, human mental styles, human quirks, all the way down the line. And that means we can think a lot about how this world would change. We understand these sorts of artificial minds.
Talk about ownership, talk about control, because at some point in time, there probably won't be if it unfolds the way you see it.
Even today, it's possible to have slaves. It's been possible to have slaves all through history. So you can imagine waking up today being a slave, having been enslaved by somebody. You still are free in a sense inside your mind, but other people can prod you with torturous instruments or whatever and make you do what they want. That's also, of course, a possibility for the future. It's possible that these M's would be enslaved and forced to do things, but like us, again, they have their own mental state inside. They can control their own mind. They can resent it and be mad, even if they're forced to do things. I don't actually think it's that likely that the M's would be typically enslaved. In history, we've seen eras when labor was scarce and land was plentiful, and then wages were high. And we've seen other era when land was scarce and labor was plentiful and wages were low. In those second eras, when wages were low, when wages were near subsistence, there actually wasn't that much point in owning slaves. It cost about as much to feed a slave as it does to hire a free worker. The times when it was worth owning slaves was when wages were much higher than a subsistence level. Then you could feed a slave for much less than it cost to hire a free worker. This emulation era is one of these subsistence wage eras when, in fact, wages are so low that there's not that much point in owning a slave. Not to say that it couldn't happen. There's just less of a pressure to do it, because why bother to enslave an M and deal with all the struggle and the reduced motivation that might produce when you can just hire free M's for about the same?
What was the nexus? What was the genesis where you kind of framed it like you've done? Because what you're saying is okay, let's get ourselves to this transition, perhaps 100 years out. We're at the transition. It's the age of M. We're here already now. How did you come up with this structure, this convention?
I didn't invent this idea of brain emulation. Also going by the name Upload, it's been a staple of science fiction and futurism for many decades now. People have written stories based on it, even put them in movies. But most of the people who think about this have been people who write stories or people who do tech futurism, and they haven't really understood social science very well. So they're just not very well placed to think through how it would actually play out, rather than how it might make a dramatic story.
I think the first people that are going to get modeled or copied or duplicated are the highest achievers, the elites. Talk about what's going to happen from your perspective. And again, as you just mentioned, you're looking through the lens of social science, and it's not that you're not necessarily trying to come up with these wild, crazy ideas. You're pretty clear that, look, if you just do some basic deduction, it's going to most likely unfold this way. And you're not even getting to the zanier things that could possibly happen. You're just talking about the brass tacks basics.
Absolutely. So any civilization the size of ours or even larger has an enormous variety of strange corners where strange things happen. The first task is just to describe the middle of the distribution, the typical things that happen, the usual way things play out. But of course, there's going to be a vast variety of unusual ways things play out. There'll be times of war or times of revolution. There'll be strange discoveries and exploration. People will try to be weird and different in many ways, but the first job is just to figure out the usual thing. When this technology is very first feasible, it'll be pretty expensive, and people will have invested billions in trying to make this work, and they'll be eager for a return. The very first people they'd want to emulate are people who are at the top of their well-paid profession today as humans. So you'd be looking for the best software engineer, the best lawyer, etc., and you'd be wanting to ask them, hey, can we scan you and make a emulation version of you, and then try to convince that emulated version to do lots of jobs. You'll be looking not only for very productive people, but people who are willing to make this jump, people who are willing to enter a strange world and to adapt to its strange new circumstances. And honestly, the very first scans will probably be destructive, so it's a permanent move. You'll have to be giving up your human world in order to become an emulation. So that's a tall order, but you'll find some people willing to do that because they can make trillions of dollars doing this. There's that much money at stake. In a world of 10 billion people, perhaps at the time, it'll be possible to find a few productive, ambitious people willing to make a big change, willing to try something really different.
But once we make one copy of me or Daniel Kahneman or you, Robin, once we make a copy of you, Robin, making the second copy, it's not
really cheap.
It's pretty cheap stuff, huh?
Right. So that means this economy can grow very rapidly, and very quickly wages fall down to the subsistence level for these M's. And so that's part of the reason why this change would be very rapid. Within a period of, say, 5 years, we would go from our current economy and almost nothing different to a new economy that's much larger, growing roughly every month, doubling roughly every month. Everything is very different very quickly. The typical speed of these simulations, I estimate, to be roughly 1,000 times human speed. Within their very dense, huge M cities, they will be burning away very rapidly and changing enormously.
Okay, before we get into M cities, which I think is a really cool idea as well, just to kind of keep giving people some flavor for what we're really talking about here, think about your attorney, and just as a very simple level, your attorney, Bob. We now copy Bob. Bob is now on a hard drive. He can do all of the work that the real live Bob could do. And there's a lot of things that the real live Bob are their constraints. I mean, food, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the M's are going to have restraints too. I mean, constraints as well, but it's going to be very different. So I think that's where if people start to imagine how this can unfold, that's where the productivity really starts to jump in. And then if you just kind of exponentially imagine how this can all unfold, that's where you start to get your massive growth rates as well, huh?
Once you have a few emulations in this new world, you could make copies of them as fast as you can make more computer hardware to fill them. And then they can do as many jobs as are available. And that very quickly can become pretty much all the jobs that humans do today. So within a few years, pretty much all humans have to retire. Now, their investments can double every month because this economy might double every month, but still they all lose their ability to earn wages.
Why should we assume, though, that, I mean, if you look at the current income distribution or asset distribution, why should we assume that very few people will control the vast amount of aims before perhaps they take control? I mean, a lot of people aren't going to, if they can't earn a wage, they're not going to have anything, will they?
Collectively, humans are enormously rich because they'll own almost all this economy. And collectively, they're getting rich faster because their wealth doubles every month or so. But whether any one human has enough or even gets rich depends a lot on how well humans insure and share. We've seen in history that this varies quite a lot. So my safe prediction is around the world, this will vary. Some places will insure and share sufficiently so that pretty much everyone does okay, and other places won't.
Let's get back to your cities. And I'm not sure all of the different ways that you're imagining storage. I mean, there's the current ways we understand data storage today. I'm sure that will change in the future. No matter which way we go, there's going to be the generation of heat. I mean, all this electronics and data storage.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yep.
This is going to require, there's going to be a lot of heat. Why don't you talk about the heat, the cooling of the heat, and where the heat will be located? It's not like this is going to be a spread out type situation. You see in the future that the cities of AIM are going to be very dense and not many of them.
Today, we get enormous value about it concentrating into a few big cities, but that's limited by the fact that as cities get bigger, traffic congestion gets worse. And so the bigger a city, the longer it takes to get around. And eventually we give up and don't all congregate into a few enormous cities. We spread across hundreds of cities around the world. Emulations can interact with each other across a city in virtual reality. And so they don't actually have to move to interact. They can just send the bits that represent the meeting and what's happening in it. And that means they can have much bigger, denser cities before congestion becomes a limit. So because there's enormous value in being close and this limit goes away, they would, in fact, congregate into a small number, half a dozen or less, very big, dense cities. And they'd really be eager to be near the middle of it. So even though there's enormous value happening in these cities, far more than in the rest of the human economy outside, they may still only be crammed into a few tens of kilometers. That might go a kilometer into the sky, and all of that is basically packed full of dense computing hardware, enormous data centers, basically. And so, yes, they'll be running these computers as fast as they economically can, and very quickly that will be a lot of heat. Now, we already know that in the next few decades, computers will have to switch to what's called reversible computing, when the energy used per gate operation falls below 1 bit. And once that happens, we're in a situation where it matters how slowly you run the hardware. If you run this hardware twice as slowly, it only uses half as many bits lost per gate operation. In that regime, you'll have enormous piles of computer hardware being run somewhat slowly. And in that regime, we can show that roughly half of all the expense is going to be on energy and cooling, and half of it is on the hardware itself. And so that means they do spend an enormous amount on energy and cooling, and plausibly roughly half of the city volume, as well as roughly half of the expenditure. And so that means these huge, dense cities have roughly half their volume devoted to enormous cooling pipes. They'll probably be located near places where it's easy to get cold ice water, and so they'll be sucking in enormous rivers of ice slurry, it's called, water, very cold water full of ice pellets. When the water comes out, it'll be near steam at the other end of the city, and that'll produce enormous clouds, basically mushroom clouds, of hot air that rise above the city. You're looking at the city from space, you probably can't see it through all these clouds.
So you bring up an interesting point here, which is nature. We as humans, we kind of have to care about nature, because if we don't, bad things might happen to us. Do AIMs really have to care about nature much? They don't, do they?
Right. They may care about nature. On the other hand, they may not, but they don't need to care in the way that we do. We really are afraid that if we kill nature, we will die. And that's a perfectly reasonable fear. And it does motivate us to take a little more care.
Emulation sex. Let's just get right to the heart of the matter. I saw this really creepy picture of Mark Zuckerberg walking down an aisle in the last couple months, and there was 500 dudes in the audience, all wearing a virtual reality helmet. And it's worth opening up this Pandora's box of virtual reality and the AIM world, because emulations are going to have sex.
Of course.
But of course, they're not producing offspring, but it's going to be more recreation.
So let's just talk first about virtual reality. Now, to a forager ancestor long ago, the world we live in, these big, dense cities, are alien worlds. They are not natural worlds. They are constructed. We find them perfectly reasonable worlds, but they are not where we came from. EMs would see virtual reality that way. They would live in virtual reality pretty much all of the time. They would work there on their desk jobs. They would leisure there. And in virtual reality, everything can be beautiful. Their bodies are all gorgeous, of course. And they never need pain or disease or hunger. These are all very nice things about the world. And of course, that means they always have sex with beautiful bodies with enormous sensory input and detail. And so they all of these sort of things get awkward about sex for us sometimes. Those can pretty much be all taken away in virtual reality. So it always goes great. But of course, sex means so much to us symbolically because it's been the seat and the source of reproduction. And that's why, of course, our ancestors had so many rules and hang-ups, if you will, about it, because they had to regulate and control it in order to control reproduction. In the M world, they would retain all our human, habits and desires for sex and symbolic overlays, but they don't really need it like we have needed it to reproduce. So they can more treat it as recreation. It's hard to imagine they'd completely get rid of it. They might reduce somewhat their emphasis on it, but it would still be an important form of recreation. Now, they would reproduce, and they would reproduce via making copies. So it's plausible they will now layer more symbolic meaning onto the copying process, just as we have seen sex as somewhat sacred and extremely important, and had all sorts of rules about who you should have it with and when it's appropriate, not when you shouldn't have it with, etc. They might see that in terms of making copies and forming new teams of copies.
In your mind, is this a life form?
I mean, they will see it as a life form, and so I'm mainly reporting how they will see it. I expect many humans during this transition will be conservative and think that's just a simulation. It's just something faking being a person. It's not a real person. And so I don't have to treat it with respect, and I don't have to care about them, and people will have that attitude. But obviously the emulations will not. And since they will soon dominate the world, it will probably be awkward to express such skepticism in public. Around them, at least, because they might even take offense.
Where will public be? Because if I think back to this Transcendence movie I talked about, public for an AIM could be anywhere where they're connected.
Sure, but in virtual reality, they would have common places they came together, just like we do, in plazas and coffee shops and lecture theaters, etc. They would come together and socialize just like we do. Just because it's in virtuality doesn't mean it's any less real to them. M's are both capable of being immortal, and they would age and become forced to retire. They are basically stored as computer files, and so you can make computer files last forever. You can archive them. And so that means M's can last forever if someone pays for it. But of course, our houses and cars are in principle immortal if we keep paying to repair them, but we usually don't. So M's don't have to be immortal, but they do have to retire, because we see this robust phenomena whereby systems, as they become better adapted to particular circumstances, become more fragile and hard to readapt to differing circumstances. This is the source of software rot, as you mentioned. Old software systems slowly get harder to change. This may have happened to Eudora, may be happening today to the familiar systems that we use. It also, something similar happens inside ordinary minds. When we're young, we have what's called fluid intelligence. We can learn many new things and we're flexible. As we get older, we acquire what's called crystallized intelligence. We are able to do many more things and know more things, but we find it harder to change how we think and to learn new styles. And that plausibly happens for M's as well. Once you've copied someone, George the lawyer, if you will, you start him out young, then he can learn lots of new legal principles as they appear in the M world. But as he gets older and the environment changes, he's no longer able to keep up with the new legal principles or legal technologies. And younger copies of him that are saved and made later and trained in new ways, they can outcompete him. And so eventually the older George must retire. That's also why the M's will typically have a whole sequence of versions of themselves around, younger and older. So they would know what their future is much better than we do. They would literally have other George lawyers hanging around, some of whom were trained a few years earlier and therefore a few years farther into their work cycle, and some of them trained a few years later and therefore younger. And they could talk to those if they like and exchange tips. And that's how their world differs from ours.
I'm in Saigon today, and I just witnessed for a few hours of where I happen to be. The President of the United States is here. And so I had a chance to watch today. The full show arrived to town, and it's quite a show, quite a political show. And the whole entourage that comes with the President of the United States moving around in a foreign country is a big deal. Having grown up in the Washington, D.C. area, and I know you're in that area generally right now too, I'd love to talk a little bit about the political implications. Are we at a point in the future when this happens where there will be human political candidates and emulation candidates running against each other?
The emulations typically run 1,000 times faster than humans. If you're an emulation like that, you'll probably want leaders who run at your speed at least and are not ridiculously slow and out of touch. So
humans are going to look just like broken old horses on the farm that are retired to Ames.
Even worse, really. So the typical emulation is extremely elite compared to humans because most emulations are copies of the few hundred very best humans. They are as elite as the typical billionaire, head of state, Nobel Prize winner, Olympic gold medalist. They're that quality, all of them, billions of them. Just at that level, they are just much better, and they know it. In addition, they run 1,000 times faster, so they can just do a lot more. And then, of course, they have all these new abilities to make copies, to change their speed, etc., that just give them vast more flexibility. It's really hard to imagine the emulations tolerating human leaders, really.
Ramit, it's not looking good for us humans in the future. I'm trying to see where this shakes out.
I don't think you should so much think of the M's as them and humans as us. You have a choice. For distant farmers' ancestors, when they saw the new industrial world showing up, they could think, gee, that's pretty bad for my children. I'll have to protect my children from this terrible industrial world and find a way to make them safe and not get too hurt by it. Or you could think, I want my children to go into this new industrial world. I want them to leave the farm, head off to the city, and try to make a success of themselves there, to try to become part of this new world. And you can think of that way about your descendants, your children, and yourself even. You can think of them as, always being human and maybe perhaps allowing a scan to become this other thing, which is an M. Or you can think of M's as you and your descendants. They come from us. They have no other origin than us. they will look back on us and see us as pretty much the same, just like we look back on our ancestors and see them as us.
Let me keep you in this political space for a second. So I know the topic is after transition, but
right.
Is after the transition, is in your mind just kind of like thinking this through, that they're really, from a political standpoint, humans will have very little control at that moment in time after transition?
Today, there are still subsistence farmers out there, and there are still a few subsistence foragers living out there. This all exists in our world, but those people don't really have much influence over our world. They are living on the margins. They are marginalized. And it seems hard to escape the conclusion that people who insist on staying in human form with human limitations would, in fact, be marginalized in this new world. I just don't see other way around that. How long that takes is another question. Since humans start out owning pretty much all this world, they can live quite comfortably in their retirement and maybe even spend most of the marginal wealth that's available in this new world. But they would spend it as retirees, spending their stock dividends rather than executives running things.
Part of the problem in having this conversation for me is I just keep like replaying on one side of my brain as I have this conversation with you. I see Schwarzenegger and Keanu Reeves, and I see, it's Terminator and Matrix on the other side of my brain as I'm talking with you, and then the Transcendence film, and then you're making the case that it could possibly all end up well for us still physical skin blood creatures.
Well, there's the biggest limitation on reassuring you about, how well things go is that I don't know what happens next. The eras have been accelerating in speed. So human foragers may have existed for 1 million or 2 years. Human farmers existed for only, 7,000. And the industrial era may only last 3 or less centuries, even though each of these eras has encompassed a similar amount of total growth. And so that means that each era has been growing much faster. If the next era continues that trend and grows a similar amount at a higher speed, then it might double every month or so and then end within a year or two. I'm not talking about what happens next. I've set myself what I think is the pretty ambitious task of telling you about the next great era after ours, as different from ours as ours is from the farming or forager eras that came before us. But I don't know what happens next, and I'm not telling you what happens next. So even if humans do fine during this year or two of the M era, during which the emulations experience thousands of years, still after that year or two for humans, something else plausibly happens, and I don't know what it is, so I can't tell you it's all fine.
Can you give some perspective on your projections? I've kind of talked around this, but the current human population is around 7.5 billion, I think. How do you see the human population will growth slow? Will it continue the same? Will it increase?
There's hardly any time for changes. This makes the humans much easier to predict, really, in this emulation era. This era only lasts a year or two. At the beginning of the era, all of a sudden humans lose all their ability to earn wages, and then those who have assets, those assets grow very quickly. But during a year or two, humans really don't have time to change their culture, to change their fertility, to change their population, to change much of anything other than spending this enormous pile of wealth that falls on those of them who start with some wealth.
I think most people, when they think of, and I just mentioned the Matrix, which is more of a thought drive type world, but the Terminator was, look, Schwarzenegger, and we could all see this robot. But there will be some M's that have a physical form. Why don't you talk about the variations in those physical forms? Because you're kind of projecting and theorizing how that might unfold, and it's probably not going to be things the size of Schwarzenegger, is it?
Emulation minds can run at different speeds, and that makes them substantially different than our minds, which are stuck at one particular speed. When they run twice as fast, that costs twice as much. So they won't all run at the maximum speed. They will carefully choose when it's worth paying more to run faster and when they can get away with going slower. They will then have speeds that are appropriate to their task. So if you drive a super tanker, it changes very slow, and your mind can be very slow. If you manage a nano factory where things are changing enormously fast, you need to be up to the speed to manage that. If you manage a physical system, then you may well want to have a physical body that helps you more directly interact with that physical system, i.e. if you're managing a factory. Our bodies have a reaction time of roughly 1/10 of a second, and that's not an accident. That corresponds to roughly the fastest time period with which we can move or control our body parts. if we have a faster emulation mind, it needs a smaller body so that that body will feel in control. Otherwise, it feels ridiculously sluggish and unable to control. An emulation that runs 1,000 times faster than a human, if it's going to have a physical body that feels more natural, that body is going to need to be 1,000 times smaller. So we have bodies that are roughly 1 to 2 meters tall, so they need bodies roughly 1 to 2 millimeters tall if they're going to control that. Plausibly, they might be able to fit their brain inside that tiny body, but when they get really tiny bodies, they'll need to keep the brain outside and what's called teleoperate the body, but that can still feel natural to the M. The shape of these bodies can just be whatever is appropriate to the task. We've already seen that humans can use machines as if they were an extension of their body when they use a steam shovel or some other sorts of machine, and they get in their head thinking of that machine as their body. So humans can do that to whatever kind of bodies are appropriate for tasks. Sometimes, of course, they'll want a human-shaped body because that's more comfortable and we have more adaptations to manage that.
So I don't like to think about dying, and unless they fix that for us, as I said, skin and blood type creatures, we probably, we probably will not be around for, too much longer. It's just the way it works. It's worked that way for a long time. So I think human beings have a fear of death. What do M's have a fear of? What do emulations have a fear of? I mean, do they have a fear of someone pulling the plug? I mean, can the plug be pulled? What is their fear?
Well, they're going to be a bit more blasé about things we might call death because it's productive for them to do so and the costs are much lower. When we rest all night and then are ready for work, we might do an 8 hours day of work and then take 16 hours off before the next 8 hours of day. That's an expensive amount of rest. For an emulation, when they're ready for the next day work, they could make many copies of that version and then have those copies work through a day's work, and then at the end, erase most of the copies and only keep, say, one or a few to continue on to the next day. So for these spurs, I call them, short-term copies ready to work, the cost per running time for work is a factor of 2 or 3 less for them. So it's an enormous cost savings, and the emulate world will be very competitive, so this will be pretty irresistible. They will basically have to be okay with this. Many people have said, but if you were one of these copies and you knew that after your day's work, you're going to be erased, you would scream and yell and fight because you don't want to die. That doesn't have to be the way they look at it. So today, if you went to a party and at the beginning of the party you took a drug which meant that you would not remember that party the next day or ever after, at the end of that party you could similarly think, I'm about to die, this is terrible, and fight and scream, why did I do this to myself? But you probably wouldn't. You would probably just see this version of you at the party as a part of you that you don't remember, but it's still you. And the emulations could see it that way too. They don't have to see this copy that ends and isn't remembered as a separate creature who died. They can just think of it as a part of them that they don't remember. So they're much more okay with that kind of death because all that they're losing is a few memories that they don't value that much anyway because memories are expensive for them.
Quote, do I want to remember this? End quote. And that just struck me because I think I have a lot of arguments with people these days, even a particular girlfriend. She's always, you don't remember such and such and such. And I really think a lot of it is I just don't want to. There's so much for us to know, and this should really get people thinking about how limited we are with the gray matter in our skulls. There is so much for us to know. If we attempt to, which is impossible, if we attempt to know everything, we'll go freaking crazy. So I've just reached the point where I just don't want to know some things, and I just forget it.
Yeah, and you have that ability to some extent, but to some other extent, you kind of forced to remember your entire life, at least to some degree. For M's, when they take an activity, they think about it ahead of time. How useful is it to remember this? To remember the details of what happened and to acquire the skills that doing this will accumulate. For many tasks, they'll decide it's just not worth it. Not only do they have to pay for rest when you remember something, they also have to pay for aging. As I said, M's age with experience, and so they may rather not age as much by having a spur do a task instead of the main line.
The big picture here of your work, if I think about this gets very philosophical. If I think about the copying, okay, we're going to duplicate me, and then we're going to, and it's like the old hair commercial, and told 2 friends and 4 friends and 16 friends, and next thing you know, there's who knows how many billions of me copies. How special am I at that moment in time?
you have a flexibility in who you see as you. So honestly, if you look around in the world and you see there are 7 billion people out there, you might not feel that special already. And if you learned about, say, many world quantum mechanics, you'll discover that there are, billions or more other slight variations of you out there in parallel universes. Makes you even less special there. Most of us can manage not to think about these things and then be okay. M's would mostly not actually see other copies of themselves much in their daily lives. They would be with a team of other M's who are from other original humans that work well together. They would have a task and a thing they do as a team. And then sometimes somebody might come along and say, hey, there's another job for a team like yours. Does your team want to be copied, or do you want to be copied to a new team? And then at that point, you'd ask yourself, okay, there's this new team and it'll have a new life. Is that going to be an okay life for me? Do I want that life? And if you say yes, and this new team is created, now there's this new you in a new place who remembers the old you, but sees this as sort of a new life now. And they own their life more to an extent in that they agreed to this life. They weren't forced to exist. They said, yes, I want to exist. I want this life. And they more accept the conditions and terms of that life as something they agreed to. So again, they don't see copies of themselves much around in their ordinary work life, but they know they exist out there and they can pay attention to them if they want. More likely, say, their clan, the set of all copies of their original, which has some organization, would offer, consulting services about, your life, basically based on all these other teams out there like you. Basically, they say, you're thinking of yelling at Sue. Well, this is how that's gone well. This is how well that's gone for 10,000 other yous and other teams who have yelled at Sue.
I'm looking at what I printed off here, and this is, I believe it's a review from your buddy Tyler. He says, I'm talking about your work, it's a reminder of how strange everything is and how we use self-deception to come to terms with that strangeness. It's a mock of all of those who believe in individual free will. Obviously, I just touched on that a second ago, but I wonder if you might want to comment a little bit further. A mock of all of those who believe in individual free will. I mean, I guess, growing up and whatnot, I probably would have thought, okay, yes. When you start to throw these topics on the table like you have with this work, I mean, even if somebody is the biggest proponent of hey, I am individual, whatever, once you put this on the table and say, we're past transition, I mean, the whole topic of conversation, if you're holding on to the whole idea of before, well, clearly the now, after transition, it really changes everything.
Many people, when they think about the future, they like to discuss what kind of future they wish would happen. And they like to get into a frame of mind where it's as if, you and the 10 people around the table discussing this are in charge of what's going to happen in the future. That if you agree among yourselves that you want future A over future B, then you can spend some time making future A happen. There's certainly a degree to which the future can be influenced, but I think it's far more out of our control than we like to admit. For a long time, technology has been out of control. That is, people invent new technologies and then they spread and they have consequences, and nobody was really consulted or voted ahead of time on whether they wanted that. It just happened. If I describe this whole new world, many people think, but what if I don't want that world? Why would this world happen if people like me don't want it? And I have to say that as an economist, as a social scientist, we often analyze the world as if nobody's in charge, as if it's not a matter of people voting on it. It's a matter of people doing lots of little things that in local self-interest that end up accumulating into the net effect that we all see. That's a sense in which describing a world like this seems to take away free will in the sense that it looks like something that would happen whether you like it or not.
Let me go back to the politics for a second. As I went down the path of talking about humans, and you pretty much put the humans on the farm and said they're no longer doing it. They're out in Montana somewhere foraging, and the Ames are in the big city and they're controlling everything. Outline for the audience, for example, how you see possibly, and maybe this is too far down the path and I'm asking the wrong question, but I'm just curious as hell, how you might see the political world of emulations. I mean, will this continue to go in what we've come to understand as politics? Will they stick with those traditions and conventions that we've had, or will they go in a completely different direction?
Politics in our world is interestingly different than it was a few centuries ago. So our very distant forager ancestors, they had a very egalitarian and even democratic political style. In forager groups, they were supposed to, nobody was supposed to brag or give orders or act like they were in charge. When any big decision happened, they were all supposed to discuss it and come to some sort of consensus. If you didn't like what the group did, you could just leave. But during the farming era, that changed. We've had more war and leadership. We've had, kings and warrior kings, and people have come to accept that during that era. And in the last few hundred years, we've had an increased taste for at least the appearance of ordinary people having some degree of influence over the government and a degree of control. That recent change is plausibly not because people suddenly discovered that democracy was possible. It plausibly changed because human preferences change as we get rich. And plausibly we move back toward forager styles as we get rich, because the pressures that turned us into farmers don't feel as compelling. So this explains not just our drift toward democracy over the last few centuries, but also our drift toward more egalitarian sharing, less domination, more promiscuity, more leisure, more art. These are all ways in which we've moved back toward forager styles over the last few centuries. And many people are very proud of this, and they've speculated that the future will be more of the same, i.e. as we continue to get even richer, we will be even more in this direction. We might, for example, become vegetarians because we will find it abhorrent to kill animals. That's all plausible if we continue to get rich per person, but that isn't at all guaranteed. And the M scenario is a scenario where it isn't guaranteed. It doesn't happen. The world, in fact, moves back in the other direction, back toward more of a farming style mentality to many things, probably including on politics. So there'll probably be less democracy, although still a substantial amount of democracy in this new world. And the M's will be more okay with strong leaders. Strong leaders have a number of new advantages in this world. For example, they can fill these sensitive positions around them with copies of themselves and trust their loyalty much more. And even if M's do have democracy, one M, one vote just won't work at all because of the varying speeds. With one M, one vote, basically just before an election, you'd make billions of copies of very slow M's to pack the election. And then it would be just who could spend the most on the election. So plausibly, with M democracy, they would have a speed-weighted voting. That is, if you ran faster, you would get more votes. And that is more plausibly feasible in the M world, but still not obviously the thing they want to go for all the time.
Robin, we've covered a lot of topics today. I won't keep you. But are there any things that I've not brought up that you really think are really mission critical for people to consider? Look, it's one of these books where you just have to pick it up and dive in. We can only do so much justice to it in this conversation. But are there some topic areas or anything that you'd like to say that I've missed out on?
I think just that overall point is the key point. Your distant ancestors, if they had heard a few quick descriptions about your world, they would have loved it or hated it, depending on which things were described to them first. Because there are many ways in which our world is fantastic, but also we have sort of given up on our ancestors' devotion to their religion and their family clans and their nations and things like that they might find horrifying. Similarly, this new world is just not going to fit your simple morality tales. It's a complicated world full of all sorts of things. And so I just encourage people to not make an immediate knee-jerk reaction to it. Think about it in some detail. See their world from their point of view before you want to judge their world. If you had a child today, and that child sort of betrayed some fundamental value of yours, you might think of disowning that child, saying, I have no child. But that's a pretty extreme thing to do. You should feel some obligation, if you were tempted to do that, to really see this issue, whatever it is that's bothering you, from your child's point of view, to see if it's something that really matters that much to you. And I'd say similarly, some people are tempted to disown their potential M descendants by saying, look at this feature of them. I hate this feature. Therefore, they're terrible. Let's try to stop this. And I just say, don't just look at one or two features. Try to see their whole world from their point of view. If after that you still really hate them and want them not to exist, I can't say you're wrong. My job is to help you see them, warts and all.
We are going, whether it's in our current lifetimes or not, the human race is going towards an AI existence at some point in time. So we can all pretend we're not going there, but we are going there. And I think what's interesting about your work to me really too is you're forcing us to jump ahead and think about these issues in the context of that world that we know we're going to, which then in turn, if we've still got a pulse left, should force us to address our current situation right now. Because if one has to start to ponder, to think about competing religions and the emulation world 100 years in the future, well, by damn, if we've got the ability to do that, we should be able to kind of go back in time to where we are today to think about those very issues right now.
So seeing your world from an alien or foreigner's point of view does help you see your world more objectively and maybe get a better grip on its fundamentals. And that's one of the values of travel and one of the values of studying history and also a value of thinking about the future. We are the people who came after the people who came before us and before the people who come after us, and sort of seeing how we relate to them does help us see who we are.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Really cool. I caught a bunch of videos also as well beyond going into the book. And I think people, it looks like you're having a lot of fun with it. I mean,
sure.
And I saw one. I think it was in Brooklyn. I watched one video. The audience was really going off in different directions and whatnot, and they didn't. Instead of just like being quiet for a second and actually letting you at least put everything on the table first. Everybody wants to kind of go in their own direction, but I think if people give your work a chance, as you just mentioned, it really does force some interesting thinking. So I think it's great stuff.
Delighted to have engaged audiences. Much better with audiences who are bored and reading their phones.
Yeah. Hey, Robin, where can we send people into your world? There's a very specific website blog they should be going to.
Well, the book has a website called ageofm.com. And from there, you can find other things. I do have a blog called Overcoming Bias, where I post regularly. And I have another website where I keep personal papers and things, hansen.gmu.edu. These are all places you can find me, but honestly, you just use my name to Google me and you'll find these things pretty easy that way.
I haven't made it back to the Northern Virginia area much in the last 2 years, but the next time I'm there, I'm going to have to come find you over there on the campus.
Yes, let's have lunch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, sir. Great stuff.
Take care.
And going out today, a little motivation, a little goal setting, a little wake you up to make it go happen. My good friend, Charles Faulkner. I want to read a nice email that came in. Michael, your podcasts continue to be a wealth of education, entertainment, and enlightenment, and I can't thank you enough. I don't think people really appreciate the value that you are providing. I've spent approximately $4,000 on your products, and I feel like there is more than the value in the podcast alone, and I get those for free. If you're ever in Toronto or Miami, we split our time. Let me know so I can buy you a drink. All the best, Simon. Simon, thank you for those kind words. But of course, this podcast would not be very good unless I had some fantastic guests. It makes my job extremely easy to literally, not figuratively, literally have some of the brightest people on the planet on my show. Now, some people might say, I have really smart people, I have really accomplished people on my show, but I think I've got them beat. The list of guests that have appeared on the Trend Following podcast are just, I'm lucky. I'm extremely lucky. So Simon, thank you for those kind words. And building on Simon's very kind words, it gets me thinking about reviews. And that's part of the nasty process of running a podcast. In today's 2015 world, social proof means something. It helps to land guests. If you like this podcast, do me a big favor. Go to covel.com, covel.com/iTunes. It will forward you to my iTunes page at Apple. You can write a review. It's really simple. Say something good. Say something bad. Rip the hell out of me. Go write a review. Please. Look, there's the please. For your time, for your effort, I will send you a Trend Following CD of extras. Simply send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the CD right away. My guest today is Charles Faulkner. Well, he's not really my guest today. He's not live today. I'm not asking him questions today. Like my recent Tom Basso episode, this is an excerpt of Charles that is really intriguing. Charles giving a seminar, and I am excerpting part of that seminar, to students that are interested in neuro-linguistic programming. I'm not here to teach about NLP today. That's not my point. But the way that Charles talks, the way that he thinks, the way that he explains is useful for all of us. If you have a goal, if you want a goal, if you want to think about how to even get to the goal, Charles is digging into that very topic in this excerpt that I'm going to play today. For those of you not familiar with Charles Faulkner, he was originally featured in Jack Schwager's The Newmarket Wizards. He has studied and worked with some of the best traders in the world. He's also appeared on this podcast 5 times. That would be episode 303, episode 187, episode 117, episode 51, and episode 3. I can safely say I have probably received more positive feedback about Charles Faulkner's appearances on this podcast versus any other guest. There's a soothing quality, a soothing nature to Charles, and he seemingly always comes at his world from a perspective that you don't see coming. I love that about him. I still remember meeting Charles Faulkner for the first time. I was with Ed Seykota and Charles Faulkner in the Virgin Islands a long time ago. I remember interviewing Charles Faulkner one time at Cal Ripken's minor league baseball stadium in Aberdeen, Maryland. I believe it's in Aberdeen, right up 95. Gorgeous stadium. It just so happened when I was doing my film years ago, that's where we had to meet given this crazy schedule. And I remember interviewing Charles. I mean, that's not the only time I've talked to Charles, but I remember interviewing him in some kind of crazy space overlooking the field. This excerpt I'm going to play is all about goals. There's no one listening to this podcast that does not have to think about goals, how to set the goal, how to imagine the goal, how to get to the goal. There's a reason that Charles was in Jack Schwager's Newmarket Wizards. There's a reason that he's been close friends with Ed Seykota for all these years. I hope you enjoy this great excerpt with Charles Faulkner.
You go to a book like Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, who claimed it's a model of successful people. Now, his idea of successful people were robber barons. Robin bearers, that too. They were robber barons. So they were Standard Oil, Rockefeller. They were Carnegie, or as we now say, Carnegie. It was Pullman and the old Pullman trains. It was Gates. No, that comes later. So there were these people that he modeled. When he asked them about their goals, he said they had goals that were above and beyond their everyday concerns. Now, can you hear that now? The neurolinguistics of that. And we all make goals, but if you have a goal that's above and beyond lunch, that's above and beyond put the telephone bill in the mail, that's above and beyond pick up the kids from school, you still have those goals. You still do those things, right? Just because you have big goals doesn't mean you don't, you have a life, right? Both. Okay. Now, some people have it like, I'm too important to pick my kids at school. This goes to the English. There's this thing, yes, well, I decide the important things in the family. I decide when we go to war, who will be the prime minister. My wife decides the minor things, how many children we'll have, where we'll live. Yeah, it's just, people get confused about this. I mean, you have these everyday concerns, and then what gives your life direction? Sometimes it's called purpose. That sense of above and beyond your everyday concerns. Now, the other thing that we now realize is that when Napoleon Hill was writing this, he said they had big goals. Now, this is confusing big content with big picture. Because they would control the oil industry, control the finance markets of America, control the software on every desk. Now, the thing is, these are big goals. And it makes the world very interesting for people to have big goals. It's also, in terms of an orienting response, very possible to take a simpler goal, to take something that people don't think is grand but could make a huge difference, about utilizing these skills, and when you greet people, when you interact with people, to make it a covenant of good communication, to bring your best to that, to realize that conflict is the nature of another model of the world and an opportunity to learn. To realize that other people are not only there for fun and reproduction, they're also there to learn other patterns from. And you can make that goal, but that goal doesn't seem as grandiose as controlling the oil industry or geopolitics. But if you were somebody, and Gandhi was somebody who had both of those, who would have the big goal of freeing a country, but he also had a goal which was a person to a person. And in that, you can make that goal big in your mind to remind you about the importance of your children to you and how you want to interact with them, especially when they turn into monsters called teenagers. Because this too shall pass. And they actually need a lot of help at that point. And you can hold that goal of two people interacting. And you can hold that large in the same way that you can hold controlling an industry large. Because the brain don't know the difference. Right? If it's above and beyond your everyday concerns, it can direct your attention. Also, you want to be careful, because you make it too big, it's bigger than the both of us. Curious thing when you begin to do this modeling is that we found Bandler for a while was doing these seminars and make your goal 40 feet across, and Technicolor and 3D. And then behind you, you have 400 black singers. These are these ladies. They have them in Chicago, the choirs, you've seen them, Channel 25, and they're going, you got your goal! And this can be very motivating. It was discovered, though, that some people do that, and it's tremendously motivating. Other people go, it's too big. And actually bringing it down to earth, some people found it made that goal so much easier to do. Instead of it being something that was up there, it was like, I could do that. And we hear this again in the language, bringing something down to earth. And yet whoever thought of connecting the way we talked about things with the way we represent things with the way that we can react, that we can change, that we can create our lives. As Bandler said, see what I mean? 2,000 years of psychology, nobody noticed that. Not a lot of people on the ball. What we got to realize here is that in our world, all right, I'm going to back up here. You know about mirror neurons, right? Oh, you don't? Not yet. Not yet. All right. There's been wondering for some time now if seeing stuff affects what you think about. In other words, does television cause violence? Does children getting bad role models? How come some kids, they have bad role models, they turn out great, other kids, turn out, what is all this? There's been much debate about this, but the fix is in. That the neurology has now been verified. There's a set of neurons back here, not just in me. They're called mirror, like looking in a mirror. This is very bizarre because it goes directly to the idea of mirroring, something that we do in NLP. And the mirror neurons are that when you see something, a part of your brain, if it's primate, hi, friendly primate, that's us. If it's another person doing it, we do that on the inside. It's literally like there's a little person in there, that you do those behaviors. Children make an immediate translation from these neurons, it's right near the hypothalamus, into the long muscle groups. So when kids see other kids doing stuff, there actually is a physical tendency to do it. It is monkey see, monkey do. And so when you ask your teenager, well, if everybody drove off a cliff, would you? They're going, maybe. because it's one of the learnings that you have through childhood is you learn to inhibit the long muscle groups. That is, you see somebody else do something, like jumping off a high dive or something, and in your brain you're jumping off the high dive, and then you go, no, but you could. And that's why in NLP again, and Erickson saw this long before, when you'd see that, the micro muscle movements. When people would be, you were doing the stuff and you relaxed people, you told them a story, and you watch people start to do the story a little bit. Yes, well, that's because they're inside imagining it's activating the muscles. Yeah, as I say, the fix is in. So you're watching television, yes. The brain doesn't know that if you put a black plastic strip around it or fake mahogany, that it's not real. On the other hand, this is why couch potatoes can sit there with the beer and watch the Olympics, and watch somebody go, and they go, I could do that. Because they did in their head. They go, that was easy. Spin it around. So this actually brings up a thing about mental hygiene. In a sense, what do you want to be able to draw on? By the way, this is evidence that mental rehearsal, this is how mental rehearsal works. The idea, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the basketball example is the most famous one, where they had, now people don't realize they had 3 groups. They had one group that did free throws and did every free throw. And then another group that sat in the bleachers and just watched. And they had another group that did free throws until they had done one really exquisitely. Then they stopped. Now this makes sense if you think about the mirror neurons. As soon as you had an event that was exquisite, then you would stop, then you'd sit down, and of course when you go to rehearse what's there, what have you got? That last exquisite, wonderful example. And so you're rehearsing that example over and over. You're replaying that example as opposed to the person who's actually out there continuing to shoot free throws, is that they're then getting every one of those, some are on, some are off, and so forth. Whereas the person, when they did the really good performance, stops, rehearses it, they're deepening, the brain is a neural net, they're deepening the attractor circuit, the neurons that are tied together for that particular behavior. Because that's the one they have in mind, and they repeat that and repeat that. Now, the interesting thing is, the people in the stands didn't improve. The people that actually threw the free throws, they improved. And the people that did this kind of systematic practice improved the most. But wait, Charles, you said that if you do it in your head, it's just like you were there and you did it. With this difference. That when you don't engage the connection between the mirror neurons and the long muscles, then that connection is still as rough as it ever was. In other words, athletes, going to the idea of representational systems, have more connections to do a certain sport. So the person who actually makes the connection between the mirror neurons and the long muscles and then rehearses that whole circuit is going to get more result than the person who's merely watching it and seeing, well, can I connect it here? Because they didn't actually do it. And by the way, it works in the other direction. If you take up a musical instrument, and there has to be that physicality, you can't just listen to music. You can listen to music, you can develop your auditory. It'll work. If you take up a musical instrument, holding violin, Steve was telling him about his kids, because his kids have gone to Waldorf schools, and the fix is in. We now know that playing physically, or guitar, whatever it is, playing a musical instrument, the connection between that muscle circuit and the brain literally builds brain cells. It goes in both directions. In other words, the imagining will influence the body, and the body, actually utilizing the body for certain things, can build up more capacity in the mind. The brain is much more plastic than they realize. Now, we knew this in NLP, But I'm sharing this with you because, well, as I was saying to the master trackers, they're going, can we use this stuff covertly? And I'm saying, look, you belong to a field. No, you too belong to a field where if you have the person who's feeling phobic, right? And they go, oh, elevators, and so they see the elevator, they're terrified or whatever it is. And you say, have them step out of the movie, watch the movie over there. So they watch themselves, right? Okay. Run it backwards. And step back in, and what happens? They're not phobic anymore. You belong to a field that if you think you're stepping into an imaginary circle, you get resourceful. Circle of excellence. If you don't tell people you're doing a technique, everything you do is covert. Because it's unbelievable. But what I'm sharing with you is some of the research that's showing not only is it believable, they're figuring out how it works. While that may not make it work better, it often supports you in the idea, yes, do this, and realize the difference things make. So the first difference I want to make this morning is to give you a launching point, a way of stepping from this program to wherever the hell you're going. One of the things we find, you also know about the research on people learning in a context. Learning is context dependent. All right. Again, studies. I don't know where they get the money for these. Somebody's got to let me know. I could use this money. A bunch of medical students, end of term exam, standard end of term, came into their classroom, take the exam. They had been asked, because of an experiment, psychological experiment, to leave an extra 3 hours after the exam. They said, fine, sure, we'll do that. We're game. We're medical doc. We're going to be medical doctors someday. We're going to experiment on people. We understand this. So they came in and took their exam in the morning, went away, had some lunch, came back in the afternoon, and they were escorted over to that auditorium where the basketball experiments were going on. They sat them down in the bleachers and they handed them the same exam. And you know what happened? They scored between 20 and 40% less than they did in the classroom where they learned the material. This is called context dependence. And it's well verified. I'll give you one experiment of many. It's well verified. That means that this room here, given that we've done so many NLP trainings, is the place to do NLP. You just walk in this room and it will happen. The difficulty is that none of you are taking this room with you. But you could in your mind. And I do suggest that you consider that. I also consider that you suggest that you transfer those skills from here to where it is you want them to be. What we call what? Future pacing. Future pacing. It's like imagining yourself doing what you've done here in a context in the future. So what I want to start with this morning is some goal setting. That is to figure out what the hell one of you wants, or each of both of you, whichever. I want those skills to get where you want them to be. You spent all the time and effort and money here. So the idea is, what of these skills do you want where in your life? And to formulate that as a goal. All right? Now, we got some paper back there? We're going to have you do the Longman study. It actually is called the Longman study. The Longman study, often considered apocryphal, actually true, is where they had people from 3 American East Coast universities just after World War II. They got the graduates, they talked to them, they found out which graduates wrote down their goals for life and which ones had not, and they checked up with them after a decade. It's a longitudinal study. This study included Ted Kennedy. If that influences your thinking, so be it. They had the people write down their goals. Now, in this case, I'm having you one goal at a time for the purposes of the exercise. It's an interesting thing. What you're doing is you're taking an internal dialogue and you're externalizing it. How many of you, if you're not sure of the spelling of a word, will write it down to see it more clearly? Yeah, well, we're talking about the same thing here, is the idea that you're taking something, a thought, and by writing it down and putting it on the outside, you can see it more clearly. It also dissociates it from you, gives you a different perceptual position, and allows you to interact with it differently. Somewhere on that page, and I do suggest the top, the side, or the bottom, but not the middle. If you do use the middle, you'll find out why I suggested the top, the side, or the bottom in a few minutes. To write down a goal that you have coming out of this training. Now, what do we know about goal setting? We have the 5 conditions, yes? Stated in the positive, that should be the easy one at this point. I want to be able to, or I want to, or I'm going to, okay? And the second condition? Specific. Now, this gets trickier because people will often say something like, I want to utilize all my NLP skills. And I'm going, yes, this is a good idea. The thing is that if you go for all, that's such a generalization, your brain goes, all. You know, make me one with everything. Yeah, and mayo. But you want to specify. Now, there's an interesting way to specify that. Is, especially if you're talking about a state, a practice, a skill, is where do you want it to show up first? What part of the skill do you want to show up first? Remember that thing, the Erickson numbers, first, second, third, fourth? You can make a positive use of that by suggesting to yourself, okay, I'm thinking about going back to wherever it is I'm going to, and it might be my office, it might be my home, it might be my family, it might be my business, it might be my church. Context, right? What specifically of this skill do I want to show up? And here we go to sensory-based. You know, what do you want to see, hear, feel that'll let you know that you're starting to integrate those skills into your everyday life? Now, people say, but I don't want to just start. I'm going, but you do. Because if you're starting, that presupposes it'll keep going. That's the idea of the first, second, third, fourth. So you want to think about something that could be fairly easy for you to do. Something you'd expect yourself to do, but you might not if you don't take this step. You'd expect that you'd build rapport with people when you see them. You'd expect you'd listen for their language, try to find out some of their model of the world. You might expect you'd notice their accessing cues or their voice tone or how they mark out certain words. But then again, if you don't actually do the future pace, you get back there and go, God, what happened that summer? Meanwhile, this room is filled with NLP resources. You know, people walk in the room, they're changed, you know. So we want to get that to where you're going to be. So writing down now, what is one of your goals? You probably had it since before the course. We're visiting it now because now you've got the skills in yourself. Let's take them to where you want them. So that's the idea, a goal of this course that will be evidence for you that you're beginning to integrate those skills into a specific context of your choosing, which is coming up next week maybe. So make a note, your words. All right, you got a few words there. Now, if you're writing a lot, and I have no objection to that, what you want to do is pick off a couple of words or a phrase or an image in that whole bit of writing that means that to you. In other words, you want to make it easier for your mind to keep in mind. You know, it's like trying to quote some politicians these days. It's gone. We want a soundbite in this case. But it's your soundbite. You pick it, not somebody else picks it. All right. As you finish that up, and it's just finishing up, making that thought of what it is, this goal, I want to remind you, gentlemen, that the women are smarter than the men in this respect, is that the language part, the broca region, the language generating part of the brain is on one side in guys and a little bit on both sides for the women. This is why they hear tonality. They hear everything. Yeah. Just so you're not too paranoid, okay? Good. It's just an encouragement to develop your acuity, because they have already. What I'm getting at here is that when you write down a goal, you are externalizing an internal dialogue. You're seeing it in a new way. You're interacting with it. You're reading it. And you're only using half your brain. It's a half-brain goal. The other side of the brain which we take to be the creative part and all. Well, really, it's about color, and it's about imagery, and about shape. And so in order to get a full brain engagement, I mean, why not? If you're going to have goals in your life, if you're going to want to future pace this, you want it to be there, you want to have both sides of your brain working, is for you to draw a picture that will in some way represent that goal for you. Now, before you do, let me offer you 2 comments. First, I come from Chicago. We have a museum there. They got these pictures from the Impressionists and Expressionists. This guy Picasso, it's like 3 eyes, 2 noses, They're great pictures to get you over any kind of feeling that you can't draw. I think this was one of his big points. It's like, I can draw, So the idea here is not the accuracy of the image, but that it evokes in you your goal, right? So you could make it an actual picture. In other words, you could see yourself doing something, for example. On the other hand, you could also do something symbolic. You could draw a heart, or you could draw a sun, a tree, or something. In other words, for you, and I'm just those are just my ideas, it's your ideas. When you read your goal, what idea or image comes to mind that if you drew that, which I'm going to suggest you render some kind of an image, again, you externalize that internal idea to some extent. And even though it won't be exactly like your internal pictures, or maybe if you're a trained artist and you have the eye-hand coordination, it will. That's possible too. But the idea is it doesn't need to be. All it needs to be is enough for you to get that feeling. You go, yeah, this represents my desire in this case. And by means of encouragement, for those of you that aren't quite with the program yet, the wealthiest trader in the world, dollar for dollar, that is to say that he's made more money for people than anyone else. He couldn't draw that well, so instead of drawing his goals, he would cut them out of magazines. He'd go through magazines and cut out pictures and make collages. He's only made maybe 5,000–6,000% on his money, but you can live on it. And again, it's understanding this above and beyond your everyday concerns. The idea of putting stuff out there for your brain to respond to. So that's what you're doing. You're creating something that you want to respond to. Not the media, not some company, not a relative, not even an old tape loop in your head. You can put all that aside and go, what would you like to be responding to more? How would you like these skills called NLP to show up in your life when you really return to it fully and completely? What we want to do is review the outcome well-formedness conditions. You can really tell this field's got jargon, well-formedness conditions. This is from linguistics. It simply means like a well-formed sentence, because a well-formed sentence is going to make sense. So for this sentence, which is directing your attention into the future, of course stated in the positive, initiated and maintained by self. Another way to put that in more ordinary language is you can do something about it. And it's not even that you can do all of it, but that you can, as we would say, keep the ball rolling. That you in some way, now, this is problematic for some people. They say, well, what if it's about building rapport with somebody? A relationship. Very often we have goals in a relationship, outcomes in a relationship, and they go, well, what if they don't want to build rapport with me? Well, what can I do? I'll tell you, what? What's this? Well, no, I'll tell you a story about one of my teachers. She, anthropology major, university. She's assigned to work for a professor whom, of course, she has to take. To put it in the simplest language, he hates women. Yeah. And women shouldn't be in universities. They should be back in the home, back in the kitchen. Yeah, right. Her eyes were rolling too. But there she was. Young graduate student. What's she going to do? What she did is the following, is that she was in this office with this guy, and she would just breathe with the same breathing rate he did. While she did her other work, she was secretarial, and he's the important professor, When he spoke to her, she would speak back in the same rhythm, in the same tones of voice. Not in the sense of copying, but if somebody speaks fast, you speak faster. If somebody's slower, you speak slower. Measured words, professorial words, she would do the same. She did this, and a couple of weeks passed, and he turned to her and said, You know, I generally don't like women in the academic professions, but I think it's good that we made an exception in your case. Yes, we are glad about that, aren't we? The idea is that even if that hadn't worked for her, but I share it because that kind of persistence does pay off, is that she was still learning more about building rapport and practicing it, even though the other person wasn't responding. So in other words, her goal of creating rapport was initiated and maintained by her. So she kept that for herself in that instead of going, oh, well, what can you do, you know? It's like Erickson is like, well, what can you do? I wonder what we could do. Of course, this goal then needs to be sensory-based for two reasons. One, as Woody Allen says, you might not think a lot about the world, but it's the only place you can get a good steak. Yeah, and everything else that we would want. It's also the way that you get feedback loops going. In other words, if something is sensory-based, you can actually notice, am I getting closer or farther away from my outcome? If you don't have ways of sensorily measuring that, you can make up anything you want. But that's not actually going to get you to real goals, real differences in the world. Context specific goes again to the idea of where would you like this to show up first? Where specifically in your life would you like to begin to be practicing these skills, to be appreciating all the time and effort you've spent and noticing the changes in yourself and the people around you? Now, when I came into NLP long ago when dinosaurs roamed the earth, these were the outcome conditions. Now, this was a heyday for NLP. We were flying first class, we were staying in fancy hotels, we were calling our friends and spouses back home, and we were getting divorces and relationships breaking up, and it was realized in all that something was missing. That is that we, being good Americans, had focused on our outcomes, what we wanted, and had neglected, not all of us, but enough that it was noticed, the larger context. We were doing this for a relationship, but honey, now I know I'm on the road 250 days a year, but I'm doing it for you. Yeah, it's really nice here in Hawaii. So the idea of ecology came into the picture. Now, to this day, some people, they like the word ecology or they don't like the word ecology, but they really think of ecology as some sort of constraint on your goals. I have this wonderful goal and now I have to keep other people, I would suggest instead that what you're doing is you're increasing the scope of your situation. You go, okay, if I get this happening in my life, I know the effects, or I believe I know the effects around me, with me. You increase the scope, that is, you increase your picture, and you go, so how's this going to affect my friends, my coworker, my family? And if you need to, you utilize that information to refine your outcome. This is not the case of having to put it aside because of ecology, but with ecology it gets richer. I'm reminded of my colleague Gary Schmidt that what he decided is that certain times of the year his family would travel with him. And he would go and stay longer and make it a vacation, and he'd work for a few days in the city. And then his family, he and his teenagers, they'd go, and his wife, and they'd go out and see the city and do things like that. Well, was this more expensive? Yes. Did it make a better quality of life? Certainly. Because then they got a sense of what he was doing. They joined him in his life. They got to see new places. It's a very simple example, but it's the idea he discovered by that he actually had better outcomes than he had before. And there's also the willingness not only to look at the upsides, but to look at the downsides. That is, what happens when you get so busy and you're so in demand that you don't have time to eat or do your laundry or anything else? People do this in life without thinking about it. This is one of these strange things about our society, is that people choose careers without ever having stepped into the picture. A colleague of mine is a lawyer, and she says, I love the law, but I didn't realize that being a lawyer meant people yelling at you on the phone 70% of the time. People are always calling, because that's what you're supposed to do with lawyers, I guess, So there's that. There's about stepping into the picture. There's life before the goal, and there's life when you get the goal. So one of the ways I'm suggesting here of testing for ecology is that you step into that future. And as much as possible, take a moment or two or three and live it like the lawyer. And if you don't have rich enough representations, what do? No, you don't change your goals. You go out and get them. In other words, if you want to know about being a lawyer, if you want to know about setting up a consulting business, if you want to know about what it means to go back to college as an adult, if you want to know about married life, go buy these people a drink, take them for coffee, get a permission to show up at their office, and build a richer representation of what that will be like. Because you may find that you love the law, but you don't want to practice that kind of law. You want to do something else. You may find that you really like consulting, and you don't want to be the marketing person. These are good things to find out. There are many, many people in the world that want to do these other jobs. Let them. You go for the ones that you want to. And so in that sense, the ecology, both the idea of the expanding the scope, so there's yourself and you expand the scope in terms of the people, you can also expand the scope in terms of time. And you're looking at the positives, and you also look at the negatives so that you can come back and enrich that possibility. I'll give you an example from my experience, because I know it better than other people's, is that at the point that I went into consulting in the trading business, apparently it got the attention of some people, because some people that previously took little ads, they took little ads. After that, when I showed up, they were taking full-page ads. I realized the cost of those ads. I decided at that point that I was not going to advertise. I went in a complete direction. I said it's completely word of mouth. I did conferences, and I did word of mouth. And my income went up. And I wasn't marketing. Now, that seems contrary, but I had already decided that what did I want to do? Did I want to spend my time marketing myself, or did I want to spend my time doing the work? Now, you make your own choices, but my point in the example is that when I checked the ecology of that, and I found that most consultants spent 75% of their time marketing themselves, I went, no, that's not what I want to do. If I want to be a marketing person, I would have gone into marketing. I decided I wanted to do it differently, and that caused me to revise how I went for my outcome, how I went for my goal, which turned out, and I did not know this at the time, I knew my experience would be better, but it actually turned out to be more beneficial than I thought it was going to be. This is the Joseph Campbell thing about following your bliss. You got to figure out what your bliss is and how you want it to show up, and realize that this is just one step. And when you realize that, it becomes a process you can keep revising as you discover more. All right? The first exercise this morning is that I want you to, each of you, with two others, get together and test for this, because you're still learning to do it. See, we do this really easily in everyday life. You go to lunch, you go, yes, I want lunch. I'm ordering lunch, or I'm telling somebody what to order and they're bringing it back. I will know whether it's fresh or, what I wanted or not, and I'm going to eat it in this reality. There's these considerations. Ecology, you go, well, if I have a big mass of French fried potatoes, I might not be awake this afternoon for this really cool exercise. Maybe I won't do that. When it's already in experience, people do this very easily, do it naturally. Where it gets screwy, and why we can actually get away with teaching it, is because when you step off of the everyday, when you start talking about things like success or career or rich, fulfilling relationships, those nominalizations begin to float. And people say, well, I really want a relationship, or I really want to make a difference. Well, how do you want to make a difference? I don't know. But they want to make a difference, and so the person's going around, am I making a difference? Am I making a difference? Example. In Chicago, and again, example because it works, we had a study group where we got together after we finished our practitioner training every Saturday at this psychiatrist's house. Didn't have to be a psychiatrist, but he was. We would practice different skills. Practitioner in the master track. And one of the people there, professor at a local university, and she was feeling very, very good about being a grandmother. This little daughter, her daughter was learning Spanish, her granddaughter was learning Spanish, English, and every time the little granddaughter learned a new word, she was thrilled. Sensory-based. On the other hand, she felt badly about how her NLP training had not turned into a book. She had this idea that she wanted to make a difference with the NLP. The way to do that, she thought, was to write a book, but she was too busy with the family, too busy with the class. If you know anything about universities, lots of meetings, and so she didn't feel any fulfillment there. Well, my colleague Klaus and I, we look at her and we go, how's that possible? We said, how many students do you teach in a term? It was hundreds. And how many of the students do you teach NLP to? It was a little under 100. So each quarter of the year, you have all these people whose lives you've touched, who are now thinking about their lives differently, are setting goals differently, are approaching relationships differently. How can you think you're not having an effect in the world? Well, at that point, she realized she did have an effect in the world. And I bring up that example because she had a goal, and she thought she was maintaining it herself, but she forgot to have it context-specific and sensory-based. And when she saw those examples, then she could feel, and does feel now, fulfilled about those very positive and very important efforts she makes every term with those students. So that's really what we're up to here. It's not that people don't have big goals, it's how to make sure they make their way into the world. That's why that's so important. And it's why the ecology is so important as well. Into groups of 3, this is going to take maybe 15 minutes, not very long. What you're going to do is show and tell. You're going to show the person your picture, and you're going to describe your goal. What are you going to do in the group? The first thing you do is appreciate. So, if we have the good picture, if I may borrow a picture, we go picture, and you look and you go, ooh. All right? And then the person tells you about it, and you go, ah. Yeah. With sincerity. All right. Then you're going to, with rapport, and we will be watching, you are going to ask the person, you're going to listen to the goal, listen, is it stated in the positive? You might ask them, so what can you do about achieving this goal? Again, voice tone counts. What can you do about achieving this goal? No. What are you going to be doing to achieve this goal? And you're listening, do they have stuff? You'll ask about, is it sensory-based? Or maybe you use real language and go, so what will you see, what will you hear, what you feel when you achieve this goal, or when you achieve this first step? And ask about, and where will you be, and who will be there? And help enrich their images, right? Because that's the other thing you're doing, submodalities. You're helping them to vivify that picture because that's going to make it more directional for them. And then you're going to do what? You're going to say, wow, that sounds wonderful. Are there any downsides? No, no downsides. Well, wait a minute here. What will this do about your time? Will you have the same free time? What about your friends? What about your family? How will this change your life over the next year or so? In other words, ask about ecology. And if they begin to go, then you can go, well, how could you make that goal even better by incorporating that? Yeah? Okay. Look around. Find yourself a couple of partners, and let's do it. I would suggest that the more important the goal, the more important the outcome, the more you check the well-formedness conditions. And the reasoning, again, is that the more important it is, the more likely it is to be abstract. The more likely it is that you're going to want it to pertain to a large amount of time. And therefore, the less likely it is that you're going to be thinking about specifically where it might show up, or specifically about the consequences. You know, those of you that have done, whether psychotherapy or coaching or just wanted to help a friend, know that very often people will take whatever it is and they'll take their negative and phrase it in the positive. They'll go, well, you know, I don't want to be alone anymore. And you go, okay, what do you want? Well, I want to be in a relationship. And so it's a sense of opposite as opposed to what it is they would really like. You go on to Master Practitioner, you're going to discover something called meta programs. You're going to realize that it's deeply rehearsed in the person's experience to state what they don't want. And if it is, that's what they'll do. They're a lot of fun. You say, well, what do you want? Well, I don't want this, and I don't want that, and I don't want that, and I don't want that. And I don't want this, and I don't want this, and I don't want this. What do you want? And they'll actually say, well, I know I don't want. John Grinder's strategy. Hey, Didu, what do you want? You know, what if it came up and bit you on the ass? You kind of do like that, you know, just to get them going. But an alternative to that is to pace and lead. So you don't want this, and you don't want this, and you don't want this, and you don't want that, and you don't want that. And if you didn't get all those, what would you want to be getting? Sometimes you need to do a little of that. Again, people are going to go global, and this is where you can do that magic thing. You can say, okay, well, what would be the first step? What would let you know you were on the path, that you were on your way? Because, of course, that's a feedback loop. You can get that to be sensory-based in terms of a well-formed outcome. This also can be taught to have huge life-changing, society-changing goals. And still, what's going to show up in the world that's going to be steps on the way to that? Having done that, we have a very simple model in NLP, which is about that gap. The gap between where we are now and where we want to be. And of course, being filled with jargon, we have to have words for it, called present state, desired state. It's in that gap that we get curious. You ask the person in question. Now, the way it's taught in the book is to ask, most of the books as a matter of fact, what stops you? You're at a point in your training that I want you to hear that if I ask you, what elephant? What do you do? Momentarily, you've got to think of it if you understand it. If you don't understand it, if it's from some other language, you know, wakarimasu ka? Hai, wakarimasu. Osh. Well, now the thing is, if you didn't understand what I said, you'd grab the tonality, da-da-da-da-da, and it's probably a question. And you'd grab the context. In other words, we're always trying to make meaning. So if I ask you, so, you know, you've got this goal, you're here, you've got this goal, what stops you? What are you going to momentarily imagine? Yeah, even if there's nothing stopping you, you can come up with something. Right. This could be called you're creating difficulties for the client. You don't need to. So I have a couple other proposals here, because we're getting to the integration. One of those proposals goes to the idea, do you know how you got here? The answer is yes, by the way. Do you know how you got here specifically this morning? Do you know how you happen to be in this training this summer of your life? Mm-hmm. And you could describe, relative to the amount of time and detail requested, what that is. You'd say, well, you know, I heard about this NLP stuff, and, you know, I read a book, I saw a tape, people said this is the training to go to. You know, you can tell me that path you took. Right up to the present. And then it gets a little spotty for some people. And then there's going home, and then there's going back to work, and then there's and so forth. But if you look back, it's a very complete path. So one of the ways to fill in this gap is to go back out to that future. And instead of trying it on, well, you are trying it on, and you're feeling it, and you get into it, and go, yeah, that's where I'm going to be. And when you're in that state, look back and see how you got here. Because the brain is a tricky thing. It will fill in those steps for you. Or a number of them anyway. Because we're very good at looking back on things and seeing how we got somewhere. It's that looking forward thing that throws us off from time to time. And then what you can do is step out, and you can re-walk those steps back to where you are now, and step back in, and turn and see those steps leading to that future. And you can see what would be the first step now that would let you know you're on that path of those steps. Now, for those of you interested in language patterns and so forth, there's a number of behavioral presuppositions here as well. By going out and looking back as if it's already happened, because you do the same thing, you look back on your past, it's happened, you're in a sense saying to your brain, it's happened. But then you come over here and go, it hasn't happened. Well, it's happened, but it hasn't happened. Yeah, like a lot of experience, right? Like a number of you are going to go to DIA, the airport, and you've been there before, and now you're going to go back. And even if last time was the first time, this time it's more familiar. So it's easier to navigate. Just like when you first were learning to drive a car, at least for most of you, it was complicated and other things to do. Now you get in a different vehicle, and you go, oh yeah, that's familiar. So the idea is by doing this, you're making this future already familiar, which makes it easier to do. Yeah, how about that? So, can you guess what the next exercise is? Now, why are we chunking it this way? Because you want to make sure the outcome's well formed before you start laying these kind of tracks. If the person goes, do you want, what do you want to change? I want to change everything! And they go out there and I've changed everything! And they look back and they go, but I didn't, this is, whereas if you say, well, what I want to do is go in and really apply this anchoring stuff, because that, I know if I do that, the other stuff will come. And so I've got this place in my future, and I'm utilizing the anchors. People are responding, and I'm noticing the feedback, and you go out and you go, yeah, I'm doing that. And how did I get there? Oh, yeah, I took that course, and and at the airport, actually, I saw this, I built rapport, and I matched their anchor, and other things begin to fill in. Oh, when I told people about it, and I showed them, and when I showed them things, whatever fills in for you. And there'll be some gaps, but now there's smaller gaps, all right? And you step out, you walk back, step back in the present moment, and then see, okay, what's going to let me know that I'm on the way? Whichever foot you like to go, okay? Yeah. Getting off on the right foot, Okay. So, you set this up with your partner, you got the present state, have them look to where the goal is. All right, so now I have to tell the NASA story, going to the moon. So long ago. Yeah, just after dinosaurs roamed the earth, we went to the moon. Yeah. Well, the deal about going to the moon that we want to focus on is this, is they were where they were supposed to be. We're talking about they're leaving the earth. And they're going to this object going at high speed called the moon. You want to get there, right? And they are where they're supposed to be how much of the time? They are where they are supposed to be.
Every moment.
They are where they're supposed to be 3% of the time. 97% of the time, they're a little off or a lot off from where they're supposed to be. There's a lesson in this. The idea of going for a goal is the idea that you've got a direction, not that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The idea is, do you have direction? Do you have trajectory? In other words, you're on the way to the goal and you get a little off track, or you get a little, and the point is that you bring yourself back on track. At least that's the point I'm taking from that story at this point, is that we humans do this funny thing where we think if we're not right where we're supposed to be, then we're in the wrong place. Now, pulling a souffle out of the oven, yes, you better be there on the moment. But there's a whole lot of other things in life where there's a lot more play. And in fact, being off course can let you know to be on course. You ever been driving down a road and you just kind of get tired and you daydream and then you hit a speed bump? Wakes you right up. In a sense, when we get off course, when the world catches it, in some sense, for a few of us, it reminds us to pay attention. So you want to be careful about how you're evaluating your journey on the way. Remember, you can get to the moon and back and not be in the right place at the right time as long as you're going in the right direction and you're making course corrections. Yeah, it's a pretty significant learning, and I don't know that the metaphor does it, but it's a beginning. I'll also tell you this, that most of you will not get the goal that you made the picture of. Well, I probably shouldn't have told you that.
3% probably get.
No, not about that, Amal. What I'm talking about is that what happens is on the way to the goal, you have additional learnings. You have additional experiences. You don't think about it, but you start to revise that goal. Maybe it gets better. You know, it's the idea that the goals are a way of directing your attention. Keep in mind that if some of these people in Silicon Valley had gotten exactly what they wanted, they'd be running a $100 million company. If you know what the public offering for Google is, then you get the idea how much bigger it can be. That's only a monetary example. It's the same kind of thing. It's like you're going along in life and you think you're developing this skill, and then you realize, wow, this applies to interacting with my family. Or, wow, I'm thinking in a new way that I didn't even know to anticipate. And so your goals revise and they get richer. And that's the way it ought to be, because it's dynamic. The other thing I want to point out about these steps along the way comes again from my experience in the finance area, is that I worked with guys and gal. That's what we say, ladies. We'd say gentlemen and lady. Typical finance seminar. And the colleague and I had a plan. What we were going to do is do a seminar on how to make lots of money, only then we were going to covertly teach relationship strategies. And then we were going to do a relationship seminar and then covertly teach finance strategies. We thought this is... Because people tend to want to go for what they know to develop, rather than developing something completely different. We'll be getting to that. The thing about that I noticed about the people who were in the finance, who were young traders, going for the gold, going for the $1 million, is they would make that the measure. By that, they would end up whipping themselves and forcing themselves and very often burning themselves out because they didn't see that some of those places along the path could be rewards. Those could be milestones, if you will. Markers. We have, for those not from this country, we have markers that let you know the mile you pass, a kilometer, perhaps in your country. There's things along the way. So in the trading business, learning to run the computer, learning the process of placing orders, mastering your technique. I mean, there's ways you can go, yeah, I did that. And in the same way, on the way to your goal, that first thing you're doing today, yeah, you're doing something. Feel good about that. And there are other places where you can go, yeah, I've got this piece of it, or I've got a handle on this. And so you reward yourself, and it becomes easier. The idea when we set goals is not to set one big goal. You want to set near-term goals, because this encourages a person to continue to set goals. You want to set some medium-term goals, because then there's different levels of reward. It keeps you going.
So like if you have a long-term goal, very big, you chunk it smaller, you get to...
Find some natural milestones or some natural, I hate the word mini goal. It's not a word. But find some places along the way where you've actually got a bit of it. You go, I got that part. So what we've done here is we set up a present state and desired state space. The explorer went into the desired state, experienced it fully, looked back either in the mind's eye or physically in the mind's eye, because of course there's nothing there, it's all in the mind's eye, found how they'd gotten from the desired state to the present state. The explorer then dissociated, that is, became an observer on the experience, and viewed that path, saw those steps. Explorer steps into the first step, what's going to make a difference, get them on the path, determines that first step to be completed. today. You could also see this as an elaborate form of future pacing. Future pacing is you see yourself doing something. You see yourself doing a lot of somethings here. So the next thing, in terms of Diltz's idea that we have a present state, we have a desired state, and to get from one to the other, you want resources. Now, I haven't written the word in there till now because most people think of resources as states. That you want a state of go for it, a state of curiosity, a state of confidence, a state of excitement. You want to be in a state of competence in your skill and bring all that skill to it. That is correct. And I would suggest that the ability to look back and have those steps appear is also a resource. It just doesn't have the flair of the resource state, but it is part of programming your brain, organizing yourself to get where you want to go in life. So now we do want to go to that more traditional meaning of resources. That is, and here's the question I would suggest you ask, what's between your present state and your desired state? As in, not what stops you. What's between? Now, right now, you know what's between is all these steps, yeah? Now, some of those steps you might not know something about, you might want more resources in those steps, and some of those steps might actually be something that stops you, yeah? We're not going to that yet. Is this another easy thing to do? What are we doing? Doing a variation on a circle of excellence, on placing an anchor. Bless you, and you too. Because we are people, creatures, with all the resources we need. But I'm unhappy with the word need. We're with all the resources we could need or want, and very often more than we can imagine. Because you think back on certain moments when something incredible happened and you had some feeling or some insight or ability, and it's still there. And we know from the mirror neuron ideas now, we know from our experience in NLP, if you go back to that moment and vivify it, then your neurology has it, and then you can take that around and bring that into the moment or moments where you want it to be there. Now, what are you doing? You're taking the V and the A, the visual and auditory of this steps, and you're bringing this new K in, and you're making new experiences that you're going to be having. But you already had them. So it's going to be easier to have them. Aren't we clever creatures? All right. So this exercise, you've just seen it, is with your partners again, is that you set it up. Now they've got steps from here to there. And then you can say, well, what's between here and there? And they might say, well, a lot of steps. They're going to, in other words, going to have some reaction. And then you're going to say, so what resource, what emotional state, what idea, what kind of skills, if you had them present here, would make this so much easier, so much more enjoyable? And if they pick something like discipline, then you want to go, okay, discipline. Well, let me ask you, is what will this, the discipline, being able, what will that do for you? Right? You want to get to, remember the idea of chunking up. What's important about discipline? What will discipline do for you? You were looking for something bigger because they're going to want to do it the way they've done it. And you're there to offer something new and different. That's the whole idea of this interaction, the explorer and the guide. So if they want, I want confidence. And well, what's confidence going to do? It's going to make me feel it's possible. He says, when was a time in your life? Because if you got yourself here, you've had experiences in your life where nothing could stop you. It's like you saw something and you just went for it. What if that experience were present here? Or what if it were, as you were saying, humor, pixiness, playfulness? It's a different way of understanding a resource. Instead of like, well, I need more discipline. And I'm thinking, yeah, that would probably work. And what's going to make it easier? What's going to make it more enjoyable? What's going to make it a delight to interact with this? And you talk and you have the voice tone, right? Because the voice tone carries. So you're talking to the person too, and you look at them and you go, oh, I bet you know how to make good trouble. Yeah. And he goes, yeah, I do. I had a few of those experiences. Okay, be a little ecological, you know. What would be appropriate? That playfulness, because you can always take the state, yeah? The curiosity. What's around the next corner? When you've got that, have the person go back, get the state, of course, you're calibrating, two in your group. They glow a little bit, you go, good. You go, now, take that with you, step off, come around, and put that right into the moment on that path, on those steps where you want it. And if they look at you like, you want to have more steps? Then you say, okay, now that it's there fully and completely, go ahead and carry it forward, noticing how it makes your journey so much easier, more delightful, and worthwhile. Or words to that effect. The question there is about how a specific kind of goal can actually get you in trouble. Right? And this is where, you know, what is the purpose of that goal? This goes to the other dimension, if you will. The idea that we've been talking about the future out here, we're indicating the past. We've had people step out into an observer position. The thing is that people do this kind of thing all the time anyway, right? Well, think about it. I mean, people, they'll project, oh, I wonder what I'll have for lunch, go into the future. People will go, oh yeah, that restaurant like that was really good. You know, even for lunch, they're flipping around in time. They're in the experience, or they're watching the experience from the outside, going, oh, and then stepping back in, or somebody tripped, and they get that person's feelings. And people don't realize they're doing all these changes so quickly, and that they add up to what we call strategies. One of the ways by physicalizing it, getting a person to experience those differences. The mat, we have the Tremurti mat here, is another effort at creating a physicalization. The idea that when you've done this, the person goes, okay, well, here's where you're in your own body, and here's where you go back to the past, and here's where you're planning for that future, and you go into that future. For many people, it's very useful to sort that out. If the person has a kinesthetic leaning, then doing the timeline work, doing the walking we were doing this morning is very useful. And I'm sure a number of you noted that Judy did less walking, although she certainly looks capable. She did it in her mind's eye, her mind's ear, her mind's body. You can do that as well. In fact, it used to be with NLP that we taught it all by sitting down. That people would do these things. It's just when we physicalized them and brought them out like this, it became easier for people to understand and appreciate. You've got the dimension of time. We got the dimension of other people and observer. You're talking about the next dimension here. And the next dimension up is about importance. What's important about making $1 million? The idea that people can become too attached to a particular outcome and forget that those outcomes are only there because they represent the fulfillment of certain criteria. Now, what's important about $1 million? I'll have you be him for a moment. We'll just play a role play.
I know of him, I think it's just something.
What's his name? Give me a name. Doesn't matter.
All right, Kieran. His name's Kieran.
Kieran, what's important about being a millionaire?
I think for him it was just he just made a thing in his mind of having $1 million, period. I mean, that was success to him, I think.
All right. And what is it that makes $1 million success?
From what I know of this guy?
Sure.
I think he can retire or something, I think is what he thinks.
Okay, and what's important about retiring? Being able to retire when you want?
Maybe doing what you want.
So what's important is being able to do what you want. Is this familiar? Mm-hmm. Yeah, is it the Virginia Satir example? Mm-hmm. You know that one where the young daughter is being brought in to Virginia? The father is dragging her in. The daughter is got the earrings and the clothes, and you kind of wonder if there's a tattoo under the shirt kind of thing. And it's, it says, well, what's going on here? And it says, I want her to mind. And of course, you can see this daughter, she's not going to mind. And so Satir, building rapport, goes, well, what's important about her minding? Well, she'll know the right thing to do. The daughter's going, Satir continues, what's important about knowing the right things to do? Well, you'll get on in the world better. Oh, so you want her to get on in the world better? Well, yeah, I'm her dad. And what's important about her getting on in the world better? Well, I want her to have a good life. Daughter's starting to look now, huh? Goes the next one, and why would you care if she has a good life or not? Dad tears up. Because I love her. This is about detach. It's a very important skill set here. That's the other side of the goal setting. Because goal setting is being very specific and getting sensory-based and getting into behavior. You also want the flexibility to go, well, why bother to go for that desired state? Because it has attached to it, stated or not, certain values that this person you're talking about holds dear, that other people hold dear. It's the fulfillment of those criteria, those values, we use those words interchangeably, that the person experiences when they get the goal. And also, they don't experience if they don't get the goal.
Yeah, because he seems always disappointed that he never, he didn't take in all the other things into consideration when he was 16, but he still has that, and every time he thinks about it, he gets disappointed.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I understand. And I, this is a rumor. This is secondhand information I'm getting. So it would be, it's certainly, long distance, coaching here if I were to suggest anything. I would say, though, that it's about what I said earlier about goals help us set directions. They get us moving in life in a certain direction. And with that direction, we encounter experience. And then, if we're awake and alive, we can revise our goals based on new information. Or as I've often noted, that what were your goals when you were 5 years old? And did they change by the time you were 15? We'd imagine a few of them changed, and even more of them changed by the time you were 25. Those changes are personal or social. At 15, it was like the opposite sex, which was either ew or huh. At 25, a different relationship. At 35, you might be concerned about raising your own children and how they're going to deal with that transition. And so we are presented with all these opportunities to apply ourselves and make a difference and experience incredible things. And that, to me, is what goals help us to do, closer to our heart's desire. For some people, it's a fast boat. For some people, it's a ticker tape and having a lot of other people ask them their opinions. For other people, it's being able to go for a walk in the woods when they want. Having said that kind of thing, the next step is to get the person to appreciate that all these efforts that you just made, that you set up the spaces again, you ask what's between you and your desired state, and that answer you utilize to select a resource state, had the person go back and get that resource state, bring it around to that future and put it where they want it, and then spread it to other future moments as desired, that all of that effort is actually in service of these criteria.
I need to keep finding these excerpts from Charles. Absolutely great stuff. Applicable to anyone and everyone. That was not just for trading. That is for everyone. Investing, entrepreneurism, venture capital. I don't care. That's relevant to all of us. And one quick reminder. Go ahead and take the time. Write that review. Covel.com/iTunes. That's COVEL.com/iTunes. Give me a review of this podcast. Say something positive. Send me an email, michael@covel.com. After you write the review, I will send you a trend-following CD of extras. And please check out Charles Faulkner online, easily found at charlesfaulkner.com. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.